Okay, thank you for tuning in today. We're looking at the New Schism Part 2. And the question we're asking today is Patriarch Kirill of Moscow, a Soviet puppet? And this has been a long issue between Russians, the Slavic thought, and Western thought. So, long history between Russia, which is known within the West as more of a foreign entity, not a part of the West. But historically, this is incorrect because Russia's identity is found in Russia's religion, which derived from the Greeks, which a lot of people in Europe, many would even consider the Greeks as non-Western. But if you're speaking geographically, strictly, you can say Greece is a part of the West. And I would argue philosophically, Greece is a part of the West in a very profound way with Plato and the New Testament written in Greek. But we're going to get started now. I argue that Patriarch Kirill is not a Soviet puppet. And this article will explain why I came to that conclusion. Because it's based off of a lot of factors and hopefully rational thought, but also my intuition. So I'm basing this off of evidence that I'm gathering through hopefully a rational process, but this is something that intuitively I also feel is true. So I'm saying in the eyes of the West, I'm talking about NATO powers, because we know right now NATO is more or less a main factor in the Russia-Ukraine war. And a big part of NATO we know is America. Many would argue that, including myself, that where there is no America, there is no NATO. And so this is a geopolitical, religious, philosophical differences between Russia, Greece, and America. Later in this article, we'll see how I am not saying that one is good and one is bad, because it's very complicated, but I am saying one is more good than the other. And we'll see later how I don't take the Orthodox narrative, no pun intended, within the America thought that Russia is still very entangled with the Soviet state, which is undeniable, but it's tied to the Soviet state to a degree that is not, I would say it's not, it's a concern. It's so the Russian state and the Russian church is too intertwined with the Soviets for the West. That's the Orthodox American narrative that we currently see in today's political sphere, but also religiously too, and we're going to get deeper into that. So I mentioned that the Patriarch of Kirill, or Patriarch of Moscow, Kirill, he is the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, and I would also argue he is the head of the Russian Orthodox people. Because hopefully most of you know that already by the 10th century, you had, I believe it was Prince Vladimir, who baptized the Slavs, and millions of Slavics were converted. This was by the help of Saint Methodius and I think it was Saint Cyril. Let me confirm that. Yes, so it was Saint Cyril and Saint Methodius who helped baptize the Slavs, and this was around, initially it was like in the 7th century, which was when Saint Methodius and Saint Cyril were alive. And they were from Thessalonica. I know I'm pronouncing it wrong, but a major city in Greece where education was a huge part of the society, because we know the Platonic tradition comes from Athens. And at this time, around the 7th century, Saint Methodius and Saint Cyril were highly educated as young men and never stopped learning. And so they translated the Greek gospel to the Slavic vernacular, so that the Slavs would understand the gospel in their own language, rather than reading the gospel in the liturgy in Latin, but have the liturgy read in the Slavic vernacular. But that was not possible until St. Cyril and St. Methodius. Why am I saying this? Well, I'm trying to highlight this connection between Greece and Moscow. And this is highly overlooked in the West. Most of the West doesn't even think of Greece. And if the West doesn't think of Greece, they're not going to think of Moscow. So to the West, Moscow is a foreign entity, something to even be afraid of. So we'll continue. As I said, many people in the West think the patriarch, or the head of the Russian church, is too closely in line with the post-Soviet state. Now, I'm not saying that Patriarch Kirill is not have any influence with the Soviet state. Patriarch Kirill does have influence by the Soviet state. Most of Russia, to this day, it's like a child of the Soviet state, because the transformation of the serfdom, tsardom, pre-Soviet Russia was very different from now the highly industrious nuclear hegemon post-Soviet Russia. And so to the West, these acts of the Russian Orthodox priests blessing the Russian soldiers as they claim it's a military, I forgot the exact term that the Russians use, but it was a military protocol, not an invasion. But either way, everyone recognizes it as Russia invading Ukraine, and the Russian Orthodox Church is blessing this. Why? It seems like the church is overreaching its influence, because the church is supposed to, as Christ said to St. Peter, feed my sheep. Jesus Christ didn't say invade all the lands, gain all the resources. No, Jesus's instructions to his successors or his followers, which were the apostles, was to feed my sheep. And so therefore the Russian state is overreaching, or the Russian church is overreaching its influence outside of its duties. Because, a bishop is supposed to be the shepherd, and the people under that bishop are the sheep. So giving the bread of life, the Eucharist, but also providing true doctrine and the rituals within the community. I don't think the role of the bishop is to start war, encourage war, bless war. So these acts by the Russian Orthodox Church is very confusing to people in the West. And so most Americans and most of the West is aware of this First Amendment in 1791. So I jumped from talking about Patriarch Kirill and the Soviet state to now talking about America, because America and Russia are the two hegemons. They're the two empires of the world, and it seems like, as I will argue, every political move is a move by the two top structures, which is the American Empire and the Russian Empire. And every political action and policy is a stream from these two empires. So I'm talking about the First Amendment in 1791. We know America was founded in 1776, so this is 20 years after the founding of America. And the amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting or establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So this is a very interesting amendment, because some would argue this is the legal precedent that results in the secular current state of America, with abortion, unnatural marriages, unclean images on the TV, all of these newer I would say just popularization of sin is a result of this amendment, that, America has no established religion, therefore America has no established morality. So who are you to say this is right or wrong? But within this very same amendment, following that, we have, or prohibiting the free exercise. So Congress shouldn't establish a religion for the entire nation, but also Congress should not stop you from exercising your religion. Quite a profound legal document. But I'm here to argue that, in general, this amendment, I'm not claiming is good or bad. I'm saying people's interpretation is bad because they take this first part and they run with it. As I said, since America has no established religion, we have no established morality, so we have no procedure to determine whether something is right or wrong. So this kind of enters Plato's question on what is justice. And Plato's Republic is good for discussions like this, but we're going to keep going, moving through this article, because there's a lot. I'm saying most Americans, and therefore most of the West, which I define as Europe, Latin America, Canada, follows the American in policy. So if I sound like I'm being too American-centric, I'm just being realistic because the world is American centric. Like I said, there is no NATO without America. And the influence of the dollar, along with America's media, and obviously their military and economy, all of these things are greater. I'm not saying better, but greater than the European states, the Latin American states, and Canada. So I'm saying, in addition to that First Amendment, we also want to look at Emerson versus Board of Education, because this is even more important than this First Amendment that I talked about earlier. So what does this Board of Education have to do with whether Russia is a Soviet state or not? And how does this help us understand these questions? So I'm saying that the American federal government is prohibited to establish a federal religion. We just read that in the First Amendment. But that First Amendment, it does not include an established state church. So America is prohibited to a federal religion, but America is not prohibited to a state religion according to the law. Well, until 1947. I'm mentioning this because the founding of America believed in these state churches. And the 13 original states all had a state church. So we can see here. I'm not going to read through all of them, but we're going to keep going. So America never had a conception or written laws in separating church and state in the way Americans think there is a separation like they do today. Once you study the history. So America had state churches from the very beginning, but until 1947, there was this new policy. More or less, it does state you can't pray in public schools. You cannot. You can't be too expressive in your religion in the corporate or any institution, because people think that is, one, impeding on the First Amendment. But now, because of the Emerson versus Board of Education, it's even more strict on separating the church and state. So this separation of church and state was not even a concept to the founding Americans. America would have never been founded if there was a separation of church and state. Why did the Puritans even come across the water and into a foreign land to establish a new community? Why did the Puritans do that? Well, the Puritans did that because they believed they were the pure ones, hence the name Puritans. Well, where do they get their purity from? Well, from the church. You have the Catholic Church, which is the church, the only church that was like an institution up until the Protestant Reformation. And many would argue but the church was only one church, and even before the Protestant Reformation, it was 1054 when the one church split into two, which was the Latin Western Roman Catholic and the Greek Eastern Orthodox. 1054 was when that happened. And then in the 17th century, you had the Protestant Reformation, which split the one church to even more separate entities. But my point is, the Puritans came not from the Catholic Church, but right after the Reformation, you had the Anglican Church, and the Puritans broke from the Anglicans, which the Anglicans broke from the Catholics. So it's a pattern of breaking and schism and creating a new entity. So the Puritans thought that they were purifying the Anglican Church. You had King Henry doing his weird stuff. He wanted adulterous relationships and very selfish ruler, incompetent ruler. Plus, he was fat. So the early American states had a state church. And now we're back into Russia because, certainly the Russian leaders had their church. And we need to understand that America's like a 200, 300-year-old empire. Russia is a 1,000-year empire. Now we see because in 988, Prince Vladimir the Great converted to Eastern Orthodoxy and baptized the Kievan Rus. So from the very get-go, starting 1,000 years ago, Russia was embedded into religion. So I'm saying America and Russia were both embedded into religion. And we can talk more about this city, Kievan Rus, but we know today it's a very polarizing topic with Ukraine, Kiev, and its relationships with Russia, since many people in Ukraine are ethnically Russian and speak Russian. And the main religion in Ukraine is Orthodoxy. Same with Russia. And a lot of the people in this area, the Kievan Rus at the time in Eastern Europe, you had Slavic people, some Turkic people, Bulgars, but also you had the Scandinavian people migrating east and south for better land. They wanted more fertile land, so the Scandinavians ended up here in this major city and mixed with the Slavic people. So that's why you kind of get a lot of Russian phenotype with the light skin and blonde hair. So I call it the great Nordic Slavic city, Kievan Rus. So these Russian church leaders were often appointed or approved by the prince of this land. So very similar to medieval European feudal system. I would argue that it's very similar to how this structure in the early Russian state was formulated. Because within a European feudal system, you had the lord owning land, who would kind of broker between the peasants, the normal people, and then the king and the pope, who were the top of the hierarchy, because European feudal system was very hierarchical, similar to kind of how the Indians have their caste system. That's how the European feudal system was set up. The peasants couldn't own land for the most part, unless they were wealthy and very politically inclined and negotiated certain contracts. There weren't mortgages or private property, things like that during the medieval feudal system, but there was a system there that clearly worked. How do I know that? Well, look at Europe before and after the feudal system, and Europe's infrastructure, Europe's wealth, Europe's culture. the art produced out of Europe at this time, the feudal system was extremely effective. And so was this. So was this in Russia, where leaders were appointed by a prince. And now I'm talking about the Charlemagne of the East. Hopefully, most of you know who Charlemagne is, but long story short, he's the father of Europe. Him and his ancestors saved Europe from Muslim invasion and unified France, Germany, and a huge part of Europe was under Charlemagne, who was crowned emperor by Pope on Christmas Day. So Charlemagne is very important in the West, but who's the Charlemagne of the East? Who protected the Eastern Orthodox Christians? And who unified the Eastern Orthodox Christians? Well, as I mentioned earlier, there were two who are now saints. They are holy and educated brothers from Thessaloniki, Saint Cyril and Saint Methodius. They created this written script that the Slavic tongue could adopt for their own. So Charlemagne wasn't as educated as Saint Methodius and Saint Cyril, but I'm comparing Charlemagne and Saint Methodius and Saint Cyril because both Charlemagne and the two holy brothers protected and unified their people extremely well. Charlemagne protected the Catholic and Orthodox view of Jesus Christ and not the Arian view, where Jesus Christ is not God, but he's the first creation of God. Like many of the Germanic tribes at the time believed in, Charlemagne, he didn't like that. And so he unified the West with true ideas and true belief and true practice. Similar to Saint Methodius and Saint Cyril, the Slavic people at this time were called barbarians because they weren't Christians, but also because they pillaged and raided Greece and the major cities, including Thessaloniki. So the Bulgars, the Slavic tribes, the Turkic tribes were really causing trouble in Greece at the time, similar to how the Germanic tribes were a complete headache for Charlemagne. And the biggest headache for Charlemagne was the Anglo-Saxons. And don't get me started on them, because they are a very hardy people. Most of the Germanic people are very stubborn. I'm speaking historically, not making generalizations. So I won't talk too much about that, but we'll keep going because we have a lot to go over. So all of this to say, the relationship between Greece and Moscow it's widely known with people who like history, but it's not widely known for the average person. Go, oh, Greece, that's the place where people drink wine and it's good weather. And maybe they'll mention Plato. But then when they think of Moscow, they kind of get that Obama rhetoric. I think it was Obama who said, what is Moscow other than a gas station with nukes? So it's a very shallow idea of Greece. These are just happy people who drink wine. And Moscow, these are just cold-hearted people who drink vodka and sell oil to Iran and China. Well, that's such a shallow view of these two, because like I said, you had Prince Vladimir baptizing the Kievan Rus, but he would have had no idea about Christianity. Prince Vladimir without Saint Methodius and Saint Cyril, who are from Greece, which I would argue is a Western city. In addition, Saint Methodius and Saint Cyril found the holy relics of Saint Clement of Rome. Saint Clement of Rome, I think, was the second or third bishop of Rome, who was drowned in the Crimea Sea. I think it was Emperor Hadrian who ordered his execution, tied a rock to him, and threw him over the Crimea Sea. Well, Saint Methodius and Saint Cyril, they had a vision and they found those relics and brought those relics back to Rome. There's a deep connection between Rome, which I argue is the West, Greece, which I also argue is the West, and therefore now it's tied with Moscow. All brokered through Saint Cyril and Saint Methodius. So this is not deeply known within the minds of Greeks or Russians. How do I know this? Well, because the Greeks call the Russians papists, imperialists, Soviets. And they call, the Greeks call Russians that because of that issue that Moscow had with giving Ukraine individual rights or autocephaly. I wouldn't say individual rights, but it's individual rights within a institution, a church specifically. So Russia did not want Ukraine to become an independent church. So my question is, why did Moscow, the Russian Orthodox Church, not want Ukraine to be independent? That's so mean of them. That's almost like asking, why does a father get upset when his two sons decide not to talk to each other? Why does the father get mad about that? My point is, unity within the church is very hard to describe how important it is. And with the recent visiting of the current Pope or Bishop of Rome visiting the Orthodox in Turkey, you had the ecumenical patriarch and Pope Leo, the Bishop of Rome, meeting for the Council of Nicaea anniversary. And that was just last week. So there's a zeitgeist, spirit, a movement of dialogue and unity. And many people would argue that it's a false unity. It's a deception. When in reality, the Bishop of Rome and the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople, Bartholomew, they're highly different from each other. I mean, look at the Bishop of Rome. He doesn't have a beard. And then look at the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople. He does have a beard. Well, there's got to be more differences than that. Well, there are. And that's why it's a fake union, many would argue. Let's continue. I said, despite this reality that Greece and Moscow have a history similar to Mexico does with Our Lady of Guadalupe, there's no Mexico without Mother Mary. Mother Mary founded Mexico. Before the Spanish conquest and the conversion of the indigenous people, the Mexica, which what the pre Mexico state were called. They were solely indigenous people, but until the Spanish came, they became mestizo, mixed with the Spanish and the indigenous. This was all facilitated through Saint Juan Diego, an indigenous man who saw Mother Mary. And through his miracle, if you look up Saint Juan Diego, you'll see his miracle. Millions of Mexica were converted to Catholicism. And this was a big headache for the clergy at the time. What are you supposed to do with millions of converts? How do you catechize these people? That's a different story. My point is, there is no Mexico with Our Lady. Just like there is no Moscow without Greece. So let's continue. So we see how Russia develops culturally. You had Peter the Great, a very contentious person. Many people love him, many people hate him. But you can't argue that Peter the Great had enormous cultural effects on Russia. Russia economy. Now, we know the Soviet state was an economic and industrious powerhouse. I think I would argue without the Soviet allying with the Americans wouldn't be able to defeat the Germans and the Japanese. But with the help of the Soviets and the Americans, the Germans didn't really stand a chance. And we'll talk later about Soviet industrial and where they learned that from. Long story short, they learned it from the socialist anarchists from East Germany. You have Karl Marx from Germany establishing this kind of socialist movement, and it moves to Russia. This was both good and bad because, as I said, Russia pre-Soviet was a serfdom. You had the Tsar, and then you had the peasants. That was the entire bureaucratic structure. But it wasn't until Marx's thought kind of invaded Russia through those socialist German intelligentsia, also teaching the Russians how to build machines and the technical part of manufacturing. So obviously with these things, you get a stronger military. So as I said, instead of different Slavic tribes lacking in organization and pillaging the nearby city-states, the Soviet state, along with now the post-Soviet state, we have a separate identity. A separate identity from the one given by Byzantium or Greece. Don't forget Saint Methodius. He is from Greece. So is Saint Cyril. He is from Greece, but they learned the Slavic tongue. And the Slavic people loved him. They loved Saint Cyril and Saint Methodius. So there's this connection with Greece and Russia. And Byzantium is just a synonym for Greece, because Greece at the time was the part of the Byzantine Empire, which is just the eastern region of the entire Roman Empire. You have the Western Empire with Charlemagne, as I said, which was all the way from France to Germany, northern Italy, to now Greece, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, that was the Eastern Byzantium. So in 1448, this Russian church declared independence from Greece. Like I said, Russia and Greece were one, united in theology, thanks to St. Cyril and St. Methodius. But now Russia has declared independence, which I do find it ironic because this is exactly what Ukraine is doing. A Ukrainian church is declaring independence from the Moscow jurisdiction. Look, the Russians did this very thing with the Greeks over 500 years ago. So there is a contradiction. If the Russians despise the Ukrainians for wanting autocephaly or independence, but at the same time, like I said, you would understand as a father who is the head of the house would be upset that his two sons are not talking to each other. The same way Russia does not want Ukraine to break up into its own little separate entity, similar to how Western Europe you had the Lutheran churches in Germany, then you had in Geneva, you had the Calvinists. And then in Italy, you had the Catholics, and then you had the blah, 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 and then the blah, 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 and then you had 40,000 denominations. Russia didn't want that. And that's why Russia didn't want Ukraine to have its independence. And the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew, the current EP, brokered this deal. The EP brokered the deal that allowed Ukraine independence from Russia, which is why Russia does not like Ukraine nor Greece right now. There's a big tension between these two churches, but also groups of people and governments. So we know that Constantinople fell in 1453. And just before this, the Russians declared independence. They probably had, foresight. They saw the Muslims invading a lot of the East. Russians had many battles with the Muslims. And because of this, I would assume that Russia wanted to break off and be distinct from these Muslim-influenced Greeks. Because even way back to St. Cyril and St. Methodius, you have not at the time of St. Cyril and Methodius, but one generation after, you had Muhammad and the Islamic regime spreading. So I'm talking about the idea of Rome and its first fall in 476. And the best literature to read on that is St. Augustine. Read his City of God, because he's writing as the Vandals were at the gates of Rome and were pillaging and about to sack Rome entirely. Well, that was the fall of Rome. Well, what happened after that? Well, then you had Emperor Constantine. He founded his own city, Constantinople. Well, Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire, they're the same thing. That fell in 1453. So you had Rome fall, then you had Constantinople fall. Who's going to pick up the mantle? Well, it's Moscow. Look at the Moscow Federation and the symbols the Moscow Federation uses. Look at the eagle, look at the cross, look at the crown, and look at the sword. These are Roman symbols. Look at the aesthetic of the Kremlin and the infrastructure within Moscow. It's very Roman in the architecture. in its aesthetics, and in its politics and policy. Are people really surprised Rome, Moscow is more imperialistic than it is kind of an independent, isolationist type nation? You shouldn't be surprised if Moscow, which it does claim to be the third Rome, and I believe it is according to how they act. But I see how people could argue just because they act a certain way doesn't mean that is what they are. But I will go further into that argument and say that's not what I'm arguing. Just because they look like an imperial nation means they're imperial. I'm saying they're imperial because ever since 988, Russia had a not theocracy, but married to the Orthodox Church, the Russian people. And because of that, similar to the Roman Empire after the Constantine legalized Christianity, Rome was married to Christianity. Still is to this day. You have the Roman Catholic Church. So after this Mongol conquest, which gave the Russian people big tragedies, big headaches, lots of destruction. Lots of destruction in the Kievan Rus, which, as I said, was this giant city with trade routes and I want to say a metropolis, but it did have multi-ethnic, but still a singular religion and unified group of people. You had the Scandinavian, the Slavics, the Turkic, the Bulgars, all unified in the city. But the Mongols really were the strongest warriors the world has ever seen. I mean, more than the Roman centurions. Many would argue the Mongol Empire is the greatest empire the world has ever seen, but Carthage, the Macedonian Empire, and the Roman Empire would arguably be greater than Mongols, but the Mongols were absolutely ruthless. There's more stories about the Mongols, but we'll continue because we'll be here forever. Since the Kievan Rus fell, a lot of the Slavic power and Slavic thought and future aspirations landed into Moscow. And as I said, many of the Slavs married into the Scandinavian peoples and built trade networks with Western Europe. And as I mentioned, Peter the Great, he loved Europe. This is what made him very contentious with the Russian people, is because he loved Europe too much. Peter the Great wanted the Russian noblemen to shave their beards. And in 1054, as I mentioned earlier, when the Western Catholic and the Eastern Greeks split, I'm not joking. One of the reasons why they split was because the Latins did not have beards. The Greeks didn't like that. And the Latins saw that the Greeks did have beards, and the Latins did not like that. It seems very trivial, but the deeper contention between these peoples were issues like the filioque, which we won't get into, but it's simplified that the Western Catholics believe that you can receive the Holy Spirit from Jesus Christ and God the Father, while the Eastern Orthodox believe you receive the Holy Spirit only from God the Father. It's like a monarchical Trinity. So God the Father is the monarch. They have the same essence, God the Father and Jesus, the same essence, homoousios, We know this from the Holy Ecumenical Councils. But the Orthodox would not say that the Holy Spirit comes from Jesus. It comes from the Father alone. This was a big contention, which started the schism. So as I said, there's a tension between the West and the East, and Peter the Great embodied this. He embodied that perfectly because he was ethnically Russian, he spoke Russian, he lived in Russia, but he wanted the nobles to cut their hair. He wanted the Russians to adopt the kind of Enlightenment thought that was coming out of Europe at the time. I mean, at this time in Europe, you had some very big thinkers. You had Rousseau, you had Hume, kind of this empirical thought that truth is hard to find, but you can prove it, but it's only through empirical facts and logic and through scientific reasoning. That's the only way you can get truth, according to the European Enlightenment. There's no kind of mystery in truth. There's no kind of there's no divine attributes, or there's no divine relation to this idea of truth. It's truth is just scientific, and if you can't prove it scientifically, it's not true. This was that European thought, and Peter the Great loved it. Not to mention you had John Locke, great thinker, who without him we wouldn't have property rights. We wouldn't have a lot of the basic ideas that make up America, which I love today as an American. So I sympathize with Peter the Great. I don't hate him like a lot of people do, but I also don't love him either, because I don't like how he kind of wanted to erase that Russian identity and exchange it for a European one. I think he took it a little too far. And then the last Enlightenment thinker that I'll mention, Francis Bacon, which was like 100 or 200 years before him, but he was the worst one, in my opinion. Bacon, he was quoted saying, "I will torture nature and she will reveal her secrets." So instead of taking care of the earth like Adam did and having dominion over the plants and animals and consciously being aware of the environment and being one with the environment that God gave us, Francis Bacon flipped that. He wanted to torture nature. He said that. And so that you could find the secrets and the mysteries within nature. Very weird, but that's the intellectual enlightenment of the time in Europe. And this, understandably, was a red flag for Moscow. Moscow did crown the first Tsar in 1547. This word Tsar comes from Caesar. Still don't think Moscow is the third Rome? We'll continue. So I mentioned over 1,000 years of data involving religion and state with Russia. And I'm saying, does this sound like the Enlightenment, liberty, freedom of religion, and separation of church and state? No, it doesn't sound like it to me. So if someone today would mention how Russia's church is too involved with Russia's politics, that's a very ignorant statement, because Russia's church has been deeply embedded in Russia's politics for 1,000 years. So we're back to this main question that I'm trying to ask. Is Patriarch Kirill the current head of the Russian Orthodox Church? Is he a Soviet puppet? I have to lay down this groundwork because My answer is no. Patriarch Kirill of Moscow is not a Soviet puppet, but I can't just say no. I have to say why he's not. And it's a very complicated answer. It's not an easy answer. I didn't come up with this conclusion out of nowhere. I've been thinking about this and reading about this. And you can see, I'll mention some sources. If you look up readers and media people such as Jay Dyer on YouTube, he takes a very interesting position that the Patriarch of Moscow is not a Soviet puppet, but rather the ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople, Bartholomew, is a globalist. And the Greek church has globalist influences because of this. Now, there's also thinkers within the American Orthodox who say that the true Orthodox comes from Greece. And the ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew is free from any kind of guilt, and that Moscow truly is just a Soviet puppet state. And Kirill was, how do I put this? Maybe initiated by the Soviets. And we're going to see why many people think that. There's evidence for it. That's why I'm saying this is not a easy answer. So just stay with me. We're halfway there. So I'm saying you need to read Russian history, but you also need to be intuitive. If I were in their shoes, what would I do? That's how we have to think about these problems. And don't use ChatGPT. Is Russia Soviet? Type that in ChatGPT. It'll give you an interesting answer, but that certainly cannot be your conclusion. You cannot find your conclusion from ChatGPT, because ChatGPT is like a foundational step where you can gather foundational information and start getting sources. But it's pretty foolish to base your conclusions off of a algorithm. The algorithm is helpful. I'm not saying it's not helpful, but the human brain created the algorithm. So go back to your human brain once you go to the algorithm and start thinking about this rationally. Pray about it too. So this is just a weak foundation about Russia state and the religious relationships. But I could go so much deeper, but this will suffice. Because I think we're already an hour in. So to add another layer of complexity to this question, it's not obvious if Russia is a theocratic monarchy or a liberalized state system. Again, is Russia this theocratic Christian imperial state? Or is it a post-Soviet secular socialist nation? Socialist communist. And I know socialism and communism, many people would argue, are different, but I don't think they're very different. So we know post-Reformation. Reformation happened in the 16th century. Martin Luther from Germany, he put his 90 Thesis on the Catholic Church. Many people don't know this, but Martin Luther, to his death, did not want to separate from the Catholic Church. He did not want to create a Lutheran church. He hated that there was a thing called the Lutheran Church. He did not want to start a new church. He just wanted to reform, hence the name, the reformers. He wanted to reform, understandably, a lot of the corruption within the church. And by that corruption, I think he would define as corruption within indulgences, a lot of the clergy getting greedy, using money as a justification for spiritual enlightenment. Give me money and it will save your grandma from purgatory type of thing. But also, the main issue, I think, was that the Bible was not translated into the vernacular. It was only in Latin. And Martin Luther, he did a really cool thing. I'll give this to him. Although I don't like how he renounced his vows as a monk and he convinced a nun to do the same. I don't like that. I also don't like how he drank a lot. But I do like other aspects about him. I like how he translated the Latin into the Germanic vernacular so that everyone could read the Bible. But there's problems within that too, because his main pillars of his thought was sola fide, sola gratia, sola scriptura, which is faith alone, by grace alone, and by scripture alone. Okay, that's great. So my scripture alone, I can arrive to the truth without an elder helping me interpret it. Well, many communities kind of take either or. They'll have a clergy or an interpreter for scriptures. A lot of people within the Jewish community, some of them take a more mystical, Kabbalistic, no scripture needed, more of a maybe scripture, but I would say no rabbi needed. I don't need my rabbi to interpret the Torah. I can find the Sephiroth, the female spirit, and I can help God put the world together because God needs me to do that. And there's secrets in the world that once you get initiated into these knowledge of Kabbalistic teaching, which just means passed on, you get initiated with these teachings. You don't need a rabbi to interpret things. So very similar, Martin Luther took that sola scriptura position. That's great. We don't have the clergy telling us what to believe. Well, now I'm just stuck with my own self-bias. So where do we go from here? So now you have 500 years of people interpreting their own scripture. So I just want to look back objectively and see, was this a good thing? And I'm saying this whole movement because now we're talking about the Protestant Reformation and how the East kind of develops this distaste for the West. It's because it comes from this religion. The Eastern religion is different from the Western religion. The Western religion was Catholic, but it's now becoming Protestant at this time. And the Reformation was just a looting operation. As I said, Martin Luther, he didn't want to separate from the church. Someone else wanted Luther to separate from the church. And these were the banking elites. The bankers from England. You got to look at the history of the central banks in London. First centralized bank came from London. And now this is affecting the church politics. These are debates Martin Luther had with his other monks. He was a monk. Martin Luther was a monk. He read a lot. He debated a lot. He prayed a lot. So you got to give it to him. He was educated. Martin Luther was. But this Reformation was a debate between monks. That was the Trojan horse. What was really going on was the English were looting the Vatican Bank and the Vatican land. Now, the Vatican at the time was the most powerful institution in the world. Some may argue even to this day it is. So the English elites did not like how much land and wealth the Vatican had. So they created this Reformation and used this degenerate monk to do that. But again, this is just the Reformation was just an excuse to loot the Vatican, and it used a theological debate to justify this. If you want to learn more about this, you can read. Trying to think of the book. I think it's Barren Metal. Read the book Barren Metal that goes over the conflict between labor and usury. Because at the time in feudal Europe, the peasants would exchange their labor for protection from the Lord. And then once the elites, not necessarily the Lord of the region, but the banks that would facilitate and broker different contracts and things of that nature. So we're going to keep going because I can go into a deep rabbit hole here, but I want us to see how communism, because that's our topic of today, Soviet. How did China learn its communism? Well, China learned from Moscow. And as I said, Moscow learned its communism from Europe. Karl Marx, where was he from? Was he from Crimea? Was he from France? No. Karl Marx was from Germany. This kind of the communism, socialism, this came from Europe. And how I mentioned Peter the Great. We already talked about him, so we can skip on that. And how he introduced Western style. I forgot to mention he wanted the Russians to dress. He even wanted them to dress Western. And St. Petersburg is a huge, beautiful city. And it's known as the window to the West. And as I said, these Enlightenment thinkers, a lot of them came from here. Netherlands, England, Prussia. Immanuel Kant, very cool. I would say a good philosopher, very interesting Kant was. And Prussia, fascinating city. I think it's Kaliningrad. No, that Prussian state was called Königsberg. I said it wrong, but that was a huge hub for this Enlightenment thought. And Prussia was a huge military power, and it became even bigger throughout time, and hence the start of World War I. Prussia had to go, according to England, America, Western forces. Prussia was getting way too powerful, and these Germanic states were starting to unify, and that was not good for England. As I said, these English bankers play a huge role within this. So Peter did some pretty revolutionary things, like abolishing the patriarch, creating a holy synod, more of a secular, bureaucratic vision, very similar to how now the Protestant Europe was formed. Let's keep going. So now we need to talk about communism. Now this is the main topic. With all of this being said, we're going back to our main focus. When I think of communism, I think of socialism, I think of Marxism, but you have to think of the Bolsheviks too. This was led by Vladimir Lenin, and the leader of the Red Army, Trotsky, Leon Trotsky. So these Bolsheviks, yes, they were communists, just like Joseph Stalin was, but Joseph Stalin did not have a good relationship with Lenin or Trotsky. So there's a dynamic going here in Soviet Russia. Very complicated. But the Bolsheviks took power in 1917, and the Orthodox Church were very persecuted by these Bolsheviks. Just murdered, cold-blooded murdered, and breaking down churches, shooting clergy, shooting anyone claiming to be a follower of God, because communism is an atheistic political movement. If you look up the story of Saint Gabriel, they call him the Holy Fool. A very interesting story where he burned a 50-foot image of Lenin. He burned that image in public and then was tortured for it. So Saint Gabriel is a fascinating character to study. Now, this is all happening in East Europe. And I'm arguing that the world has never seen this Christian persecution since Emperor Diocletian. It's even worse than Emperor Diocletian, just numbers speaking. And the Roman emperors were probably more sadistic than the Bolsheviks, believe it or not. But the Bolsheviks killed way more. There's so many different sources, but I think the universal number is over 20 million Christians killed in Russia. We have to keep this in mind, especially when thinking about global wars, communism, socialism, religion. These are subjects you need to learn. So that's what I'm saying. You need two topics if you want to understand Russia as an American. Topic one, you need to read about Prince Vladimir and how he helped to baptize these Slavic peoples 1,000 years ago. Kind of funny when Americans get this American spirit of American exceptionalism. Oh, we're the greatest country to ever live, greatest empire, and we've been here forever and always will last. Meanwhile, Russians are like, that's cute. We've been alive and thriving since 1000 AD versus 1776. The second topic you need to know is the Bolsheviks. You need to learn about Lenin. You need to learn about Trotsky. What did they do? What did they believe in? I'm not talking necessarily about Stalin, as you probably have noticed, because Stalin was very complicated. As I said, Stalin wasn't a huge fan of Lenin and Trotsky, who were the most barbaric when it comes to this persecution of Christians. Stalin did persecute Christians, but he also then invited the Orthodox Church because he wanted more people involved in the war. And he realized that the Slavic people are so embedded to their religion that, I mean, you either kill them and you don't have an army, or you accept the fact that they worship God and then they can serve your army. So it's a give and take, and it's a very complicated thing. So Stalin did allow some revival of the church, which makes him more complicated. As I'm saying, it's Trotsky and Lenin, not very complicated. Murderers, possessed by sadistic spirits. While Stalin had that aspect, but there was also part of him, he grew up Orthodox. His mother was Orthodox. He was from Georgia, not from Russia. So he kind of had this outside perspective, and he was a short man, so he probably had some kind of, not trying to do a Freudian analysis, but you can kind of put these things together. He loved power. He wanted power. He did change Russia from a serfdom to a nuclear powerhouse, all within his generation. So he's a fascinating character. Obviously a murderer and did terrible things. But I am saying he's a little more complicated than the Bolshevik party when it comes to this topic of communism. And anyone who might say that Russia isn't that bad, many of the Westerns would claim that's a Russian propagandist, because of these cruelties and atrocities that Soviet Russia imposed on its own people, much less it imposed on Poland and Romania and other parts of Eastern Europe. I mean, understandably, you can hopefully understand. I don't have to explain this, why communism and socialism is a red flag for the West. So, as I said, Stalin did reverse course and he allowed some revival of the church. He did meet with church leaders, Stalin did, and he elected a new patriarch, Sergius. Now, this patriarch gives a lot of Orthodox outside of Russia a big red flag. Because this patriarch was permitted by Stalin, it seems almost as if the state, which is embodied by Stalin, is the superior to the patriarch, since it is Stalin who permits these elections. Now, there was a council for the affairs of the Russian Orthodox Church, which did close ties to the state, even with secret police oversight in some incarnations. And this to ensure that the church remained under state control. And this created huge division in Moscow. Are people going to ally with the state or completely reject the state? And what does the religious leaders of Greece have to do with whether or not Russia's clergy are Soviet puppets? We're almost done, but now we're on the meat and potatoes of this. Because the Russian Orthodox Church had jurisdiction in Ukraine for many, many years. Over 300 years. The Russian Church had jurisdictional supremacy over Ukraine from 1686 to 2018. Well, what happened in 2018 that changed all of this? Well, the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople, Bartholomew, as I said, he brokered this deal where Ukraine would separate from Moscow. Well, why would Moscow even have jurisdiction over Ukraine? Moscow and Kiev are so far from each other. Why would Moscow want jurisdiction over a geographical location nowhere near them? Why would they want that? Well, that's almost asking, like, why does the Catholic Church want jurisdiction for Catholics in Italy and Philippines? And Italy and the Philippines aren't close to each other at all. In mainland Europe and Eastern Asia, why does the Catholic Church have jurisdiction over both of them? Italians, a lot of them are Catholic, and Filipinos, a lot of them are Catholic. So maybe you can see why Russia was hesitant when Ukraine split from Moscow in 2008. This is a question of unity. How do we keep unity and avoid schism? So I'm asking, what changed then? Why did Ukraine separate from Russia? And why did Russia get so mad about this? Well, my point is, if you mess with someone's church, you mess with their entire identity. And people will not kill or die for political reasons. They die for religion. And the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople, he's considered by a lot of the Greek Orthodox as the first among equals. So in other words, the patriarch of Constantinople was like his own pope. Because the Bishop of Rome, he doesn't consider himself, I would say, as the only authority, but he is the supreme authority. How do I know this? Because if you read the documents in Vatican I, you see this idea of papal supremacy. The bishop or the Pope of Rome is supreme. He's the first among equals. Well, Constantinople adopted this idea. So you can imagine how the Russians Orthodox would think of this. Because as we go back to 1054, as I said, in that schism between the Catholics and the Orthodox, part of the problem the Orthodox had with the Catholics was, the Pope was kind of starting to make these claims that he is the first among equals. A council isn't valid unless the Pope is there or presides over it. Or like I said, a council is not valid unless the Bishop of Rome is participating. It's because the Catholic means universal. You need all patriarchs, all bishops across all regions to participate in these councils. And Vatican II, we know, is far, far after the Great Schism. So this development of first among equals gets more and more fleshed out as each year goes by. So, as I said, the EP sees his jurisdiction as Second Rome. Well, Moscow thinks they're Third Rome. The EP kind of is ignoring that Constantinople is now Istanbul. Constantinople did fall to the Turks, who did rename Constantinople to Istanbul. And you see the Hagia Sophia has the Arabic script. It's now a mosque. It's no longer a church. So this becomes a big problem. The ecumenical patriarch is acting like a Catholic pope. And Orthodox don't have a pope. They have patriarchs and bishops, but they don't have a pope. And the Coptic Church has the Coptic Pope. But certainly that I think they use the word Pope just as a name. It's less of a function and more of a name, because the Coptics don't claim jurisdiction over Greece or over America. Just because the Bishop of Rome does claim jurisdiction over Greece and over America, over the entire world, which is hence the name Catholic Universal. So there's a difference between the Coptic Pope and the Roman Pope, but for the most part, Orthodox, they don't have a Pope, and they completely reject this idea of the Pope. Because if they did accept the idea of a Pope, they would no longer be Orthodox and they would be Catholic. So this is heresy, according to the Orthodox. What's heresy? Again, the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople seeing himself as a pope. That's heretical, according to Russians. So the OCU, Orthodox Church of Ukraine, had its independence autocephaly by this ecumenical patriarch. And it's now canonical for Ukraine to have its own body. Well, the Russian church are like, to heck with these people. We were once united and now they want to be separate from me. So they officially severed communion with Constantinople. Very interesting. We see the Protestant Reformation dividing Europe. Look at America. Look at how divided it is religiously, morally, in principle and doctrine and policy. You have people wanting big government. You want people small government. You want people that bomb this country. Then you have people that want absolutely no intervention. There's no unity in America. And Russia was afraid that positions like this would result in Eastern Europe kind of following that American secular division. So Constantinople violated Orthodox canon law, according to Moscow. And so now you have Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the Moscow Patriarch, which are the Ukrainian peoples, but they reject that autocephaly and they want to continue union with Moscow. But this body is now under very deep pressure and is getting sacked and getting persecuted by the current Ukrainian regime, as I said, which is now brokered by the West or Constantinople, the ecumenical patriarch. Some, as I said, thinkers like J. Dyer would say it goes even further than just the ecumenical patriarch persecuting these Christians who want unity with Moscow. It's not just the ecumenical patriarch; it's also the Roman bishop, the Bishop of Rome, and Catholics, and the Protestants, and the CIA, and as I said, the secular, anti-moral, anti-principle, disunified Western idea. All of that is affecting this issue, according to thinkers like J. Dyer, which I encourage you to look up. Very fascinating. His arguments, very intelligent. I do disagree with a lot of his things, though. Mostly his complete rejection of the Bishop of Rome. I think it's pretty foolish to completely reject a apostolic bishop. That's, as a smart person, that's not a very smart move to make. But other than that, his thought is great. We're almost done. I'm saying there's not much people from the West can do about this, but you should pray and study this topic. Then I mentioned 20 to 30, and sometimes some sources say 40 million Orthodox Christians were killed from the Soviet state. This is a serious topic. And now it seems Ukraine seems to be a tool for larger powers. Ukraine, what does Ukraine have if it doesn't have the Americans and the French training them with equipment, with fighter jets, with artillery, with intelligence, Palantir, these Western assets are being used in Ukraine, and it's used to check Russia's industry. As I said, there's two superpowers, America and Russia, and every policy, politically, religiously, socially, stream from these two empires. So it's basically a giant NATO chessboard, and Ukraine is just a pawn being used. And you should look more about these kind of wars, and you have these different puppet states. And as Ukraine moves farther away from Moscow and relies more on NATO, it's going to be very interesting to see how both the Ukrainian church that is independent from Moscow and the Ukrainian church that is still with Moscow, and how Moscow responds along with how the West responds. Let's finish with St. John Chrysostom. I say and protest that to make a schism in the church is no less an evil than to fall into heresy. That's the end of this article. Thank you for listening to A New Schism, Part 2.